All right, I've been sick over the past couple weeks and my throat is really on the verge of giving out. Hey everybody, Deathblade here with another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ, and this is another topic that was voted on by the patrons on my Patreon. Now, truth be told, there was actually a tie between two different ones, and I'm going to pick this one because I've actually been preparing for and thinking about this one for a long time. The other one that was the tie that I chose not to do was the classic villain attacks the main character and tries to kill him, main character fights back, and they get angry. So if you want me to talk about that topic, I'm going to include it on the next poll. It should be active as of the release of this video, so check out the description below to go to my Patreon and support and vote. Also, another thing, this right here that I'm wearing is the Immortal shirt from my merchandise store. So I have a whole bunch of different cool shirts there. This is from a line that has Immortal, Demon, Devil, God, Ghost, and a whole bunch of, not a whole bunch, several others, I think about 9 different versions. It's all custom calligraphy that I got done just specifically for this. So this is the Immortal one, and I bought the extra large one for myself. It was big when I got it. After washing it, shrank down a bit. It's still a little bit long for my liking, but in terms of the fit up here, it's pretty good. So I would say the sizes on the site tend to go a little bit larger than what I would normally be used to. You can find the link in the description below. Check them out. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff. So today I'm talking about 5 really frustrating things about the Chinese language that I have encountered in translating Chinese fantasy novels. Now, a long time ago, I did a video talking about the most frustrating things about translating Chinese fantasy novels, and I guess this is kind of an addendum to that. What I noticed after that video was that there continued to be things that popped up over and over again that frustrated me, and so I started kind of writing them down so that I could get a good list to share with you guys. So without any further ado, let's get into it, the top 5 most frustrating things, in addition to the other frustrating things that I talked about in that other video. Number 1 is a specific Chinese word, and that word is 以下. Now, basically the reason why 以下 is really frustrating is because it has 2 definitions. Now, I have asked Chinese people about this. I've asked Madame Deathblade about this. When I encounter this word in the novels and I'm unclear about it, sometimes I'll go and I'll show it to her and be like, what do you think it means? And she'll give me one definition or the other. But in the end, there is no standard definition for whether 以下 means less than or less than and equal to. It can mean both, and both definitions are in the dictionary, and I have seen authors use both definitions. So for example, maybe the main character is trying to collect a certain number of things, and it'll say as long as you have this certain amount of things, you can do X, Y, Z, and then it'll describe that number of things as 100以下. Now, that could mean 100 or less. It could also mean less than 100. But the Chinese word is the same, 以下. I've seen it used both ways. If anybody out there, I swear to God, if anybody out there tries to argue with me about this in the comment section, I'm just gonna ignore you. Because I guarantee you, 100%, I've seen it used both ways. Sometimes I'll come across this and I'll try to decide, is this supposed to be 100 or less, or is it supposed to be less than 100? And I'll just pick one of them, and then come to find out, I'm wrong, and it's the other one. I've done it both ways. I've tried to keep track and be statistically which is it more likely to be. There's no rhyme or reason for it. Super frustrating. So that's number 5. Let's go on to number 4. Actually, number 4 and number 3 are both about dialogue attribution. So in other words, the he said, she said kind of thing. And one thing that I have seen many, many, many times is dialogue attribution to multiple characters. Now, sometimes in Chinese culture, this is a thing. You'll see it, whether it's in modern times, like maybe in a formal setting, whether it's in ancient times, like during the royal court or the imperial court, you'll see all the people say the same thing at the same time. Kind of similar to how if it's at a birthday party, everyone will say happy birthday at the same time. But in Chinese culture, there are a lot more sort of set phrases and sayings that people will know and then use at the same time, especially in those old wuxia and period court drama type things. All of the imperial eunuchs or the government ministers will be together and they'll say something like, long live your majesty, may you live to 10,000 years, or whatever it is. And it's not just a sentence, but they say it all at the same time together. Now that's fine, I can totally understand it if it was like, long live your majesty to 10,000 years, they said. But sometimes, and I think this is just author laziness, the author will slip into an actual dialogue sequence where the main character is interacting with a group of people, and they will have a group of people saying things that are clearly not like that. It'll be like,
Well, I think we should go to this other location to acquire this new thing. If we do that, we can all become super powerful.
They said, and it's like, I'm sorry, but no, like they don't have mind links. These are just a random group of people that are allies or friends or something. They are not gonna have this really long conversation that's completely not scripted and they all say it at the same time. It doesn't matter. I understand what it is supposed to be in Chinese. It's basically describing a conversation between a group and a person, or maybe two groups, and that I don't think the author literally intends for the entire group to be saying that thing. It's just that that's the dialogue coming from that group. But it's really weird because in English it just sticks in my mouth and it just is like really weird, and I don't like it. So sometimes I will step in and I will pick one of the characters in that group to be the person expressing this long bit of dialogue. Sometimes I'll use other ways to try to kind of like gloss over that fact. Regardless, whenever I come across this, man, it's a real headache for me. Now, there's a second dialogue attribution thing that I find frustrating. And this is super, super, super typical Chinese style. Now, I do have to point out there is not really a formal set of grammar rules in Chinese or style rules. It's not like in the West where for many, many decades there have been some general guidelines for how to do dialogue, how to do sentence and paragraph structure. The thing is that doesn't exist in Chinese. And I've seen people complain about it like, oh, that's such bad writing. No. It's not bad writing, it's just different. Just because it's not the way that we do it in the Western world, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's a completely different culture, different writing system, different way of thinking and everything. So to expect the Chinese language, the written language, to be exactly like the written language in English is just, well, stupid in my opinion. But that doesn't make it any less frustrating. And another dialogue attribution thing that I find really hard to deal with sometimes is the dialogue attribution will come at the end of a really long bit of dialogue, sometimes an entire paragraph. Now, one of the things I learned way early on, I mean, this is before I even was thinking about anything to do with learning Chinese, back when I was just interested in writing and whatnot. I did a lot of study about writing, creative writing, reading books, going to workshops, all of that different thing. And everybody knows that the general rule of thumb in writing English fiction is that you do the he said or she said after the first short bit of dialogue. So it's like,
hey, let's go to the movies,
said Frank. Or Frank said, then you go on to do whatever else that he says. You don't go,
hey, let's go to the movies. I also, on the way, want to stop and get some candy. Oh, by the way, I need to fill up my car with gas because I'm really running low. And also, I need to make sure I'm home by 9.
Said Frank. Like, no, we don't usually do that in English, but in Chinese it's really common, and this can make the translation process frustrating. I do read ahead when I translate. I don't just sit down having no idea what's coming and then just start typing. But that said, that doesn't mean I remember every single line of dialogue in the entire novel, and sometimes it's hard to tell who's talking, and that can affect the language you use in the dialogue, and sometimes just the meaning of what's happening depending on the context of who's talking. When a statement is written out, is it speculation because it comes from one character who is not sure of what's going on, or is it an explanation of the situation by a different character who actually does know what's going on? Well, over the years, I've obviously learned to deal with this. Usually, when I come to a dialogue, unless I'm absolutely certain, I just jump to the end to see who it is, and then I go back. Man, when I first was starting out translating, sometimes it was real frustration to be running into these lines of dialogue and not be sure who was talking until I get to the end and find out, oh, it's actually not the main character who is asking the question, it's the boss who's explaining it. Okay, that was number 3. Sorry, I'm getting a little amped up here. I'm kind of starting to rant. We're into number 2 out of 5, right? The next 2, the number 2 and number 1, are actually a little bit connected. I would have a hard time trying to decide which one is more difficult and frustrating than the other, so let's just randomly put them in order. First one is about punctuation consistency. The thing is, there is basically not really any formal rules about punctuation in Chinese. Goes along with that, there's no rules of specific formalized rules of grammar, and based on my understanding, the average college-educated student in China doesn't really have much formal education in terms of writing. I found this out when I taught at the college level. I was teaching a class of senior students, and I was thinking, oh, like maybe I'll just have them write an essay or something. This was like the first week of class. I decided to have an essay, not that week for homework, but like a couple weeks later. Literally, none of the students in that class had ever written an essay. All of them were like, we've never written an essay. Usually Chinese college students don't write an essay until their thesis at the end of college. My mind was like blown because I've written stories and essays going back into elementary school. The point of what I'm saying is that there's very little emphasis on the rules and the art of writing. So because of that, the use of punctuation is very loose. There is a common thing where entire paragraphs will just be punctuated by commas. I think I've talked about this in other videos before, but man, it is really, really nightmarish sometimes when you get a block of text with a bunch of fragments that are all commas and you have to try to figure out which one is the period. Because I'm not a native Chinese speaker, that's a lot harder for me. Many times in frustration, I just go to my wife, man, and be like, what is going on here? Where's the sentence end? And she'll kind of read it, she'll be like, okay, blah, 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 period. Blah, 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 period. Blah, 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 question mark. And it's all just commas in Chinese. Man, that is really hard because just think about a paragraph in which there's all commas and no periods. Sometimes it would be obvious where the breaks are supposed to go, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes it can be very vague, trying to decide, does this clause go with this clause or that clause? And it can completely change the meaning. I cannot count how many times I have wasted 5, 10, 15 minutes of time trying to decipher a complicated paragraph just because the punctuation isn't clear. Finally, the number one, which ties with that other one, that is term consistency. This also drives me absolutely crazy. And by no term consistency, what I mean is that sometimes the authors will switch back and forth between similar but different terms in terms of like the form of address, sometimes even the name of the technique, sometimes the name of the weapon, or even personal names for people, and that can sometimes be typos, but sometimes not always. One example is in my project, A Will Eternal, in the early parts, there was a patriarch in the sect who was described, I translated it as his name being Frigid Sect because he was named after this sect. Then later on, it actually just kind of changed his name to being called Patriarch Spirit Stream because the later sect was called the Spirit Stream sect. He was the same guy, but it literally changed his name with no explanation. And I've seen that many, many times. Like for example, there's a common term, Laozu. Laozu means patriarch, but then you'll have something like Xianzu, which literally means like the original ancestor, but I've seen those terms mixed and matched. And sometimes it'll do the same thing with a technique. You know, early on it'll call it the ultra blood death technique, but then later on it's the super blood killing fist. Now, sometimes it's so different that unless you are paying attention and know from context what's going on, you might think it's a different technique or move. And I have done that before where I translated it differently than I was saying, wait a second, this is the same thing from 30 chapters ago. Of course, some of this is just because the author might forget. Okay, I've done my own writing as well, and there have been many times when from one chapter to the next, I'll forget what I called something in the previous chapter. Maybe I'll misremember it. So totally understandable, doesn't make it any less frustrating. Another thing is that in Chinese, it's a lot more vague of a language and a lot less precise. For example, you can just look at Chinese characters and see there's no such thing as capital letters or lowercase letters. And so because of that, the distinction between proper nouns and improper nouns is not as great. It's sometimes, to some authors, I think they don't even really think about it. So whereas we might be thinking the Empire State Building, they might just be thinking tall building in New York. And so sometimes they'll call it Empire State Building, sometimes they'll call it Tall New York Building. It's really, they might call it the New York State Building, all of those things being the same thing, and they're just kind of off the top of their head thinking, what was that building? And they, oh yeah, it's that building in New York, and they call it the New York Building. Obviously that's just an example I came up with off the top of my head. So those are the 5 things that I'm adding to my list of the most frustrating things to deal with when translating Chinese fantasy novels, and kind of just in Chinese in general. The 以下, which is a number or less, but sometimes it means less than that number. Dialogue attribution, whether that's attributing the dialogue to multiple characters or attributing the dialogue after a huge line of text. Both of those I find really hard to deal with. And finally, the consistency, whether it's punctuation consistency or term consistency, those are all things that I find really difficult to deal with. And as I go through my day, translating hour after hour after hour, chapter after chapter after chapter, sometimes these problems all crumble up together until my mind just like, and then I want to give up translating. Kind of just kidding about that, but all right, I've been sick over the past couple weeks and my throat is really on the verge of giving out. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you'd like to support the channel, please do like and subscribe, share the video. Again, check out the description below, either for the links to the t-shirts or for the Patreon link to where you can vote on the topics for the videos. And that's it for this video. I'll see you next time. Godsala.